Welcome to today's webinar, What is a Walkability Study and Why Should You Do One? Hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I am the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is What is a Walkability Study and Why Should You Do One? You can also search for event number 9215279. I would also like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So today we welcome back Jeff Speck. Jeff is a city planner and urban designer who, through writing, lectures, and built work, advocates internationally for more walkable cities. As Director of Design at the National Endowment for the Arts, he oversaw the Mayor's Institute on City Design and created the Governor's Institute on Community Design. Prior to joining the endowment, Speck spent 10 years as Director of Town Planning at Dwani Plater Zyberk & Company. He is author of Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making It Better Places, Walkable City, How Downtown Can Survive America One Step at a Time, and he is the co-author of Suburban Nation, The Rise of Sprawl and the Decline of the American Dream, as well as the Smart Growth Manual. Following his presentation, Jeff will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So before we turn it over to Jeff, we're going to launch a quick poll to find out where everybody is joining from us today. If you're unable to respond to the poll, you may need to exit from full screen mode so that you can access the widget that will take your response. And we'll leave this open for few seconds to give everybody a chance to respond, and then you can see where everyone's coming from. It's always an interesting mix and always a little bit different. And looking at the preliminary results, we have an international audience today, as well as those joining us throughout the US. So welcome to everyone. We'll just leave this open a couple more seconds. We'll show so you can see as well. So today, 28% are from the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, 22% the South of the US, 20% Midwest, 17% the West, and actually 13% international. So with that, I'm going to welcome Jeff Speck. Hey, Jeff.
Thank you. I've turned on my mic. I'm turning on my camera. Hi, everybody. So excited to be here. We had over 1,800 people register for this webinar. I'm not sure how many of you are on yet, but that's such a great crowd. I really, I'm honored to have so many people, and that means I'm gonna work really hard to make this entertaining for you. I know if you're like me and you've signed up for a webinar, you've probably got some other windows open, and some other stuff going on, I'm hopeful that I will make this so exciting that you're going to want to turn all that off and pay attention to only me and my team here. And thanks to you all for putting this together. I had a few questions of my own to ask. So if we could go to the poll number 1, this will help me do a better job at catering this lecture to my audience. First question, what is your primary profession? And I'll let you fill this in. I would ask you guys to fill these in quickly so we can keep moving. I was tempted to start to introduce my talk as you fill these in, but I really want to have continuity as I speak, so I will just stall while you do this. What should I talk about? Let's see. The third and fourth question, which we'll get to, have to do with how familiar you are with my work, which is actually sounds kind of egotistical, and perhaps it is, but I'm very curious to know how much you already know about the stuff that I usually present. I can see the results. Okay. I can describe them. Does everyone get to see the results, or am I just seeing them?
But he can see them.
Okay, so I don't have to take you through it. Remarkable how many planners and transportation planners. That's fantastic. Let's go to the next question. What type of agency or entity do you work for? Maybe you're self-employed, but are you public, private, not-for-profit, academic, or other? While you're doing that, I'll thank Island Press for helping to sponsor this event, for publishing my book, for being so great at outreach and network, and for inviting me to do this, which is the second one of these I've done since the book came out in late 2018. Okay, the vast majority are public. Got it. So most of you work for, probably for planning agencies or for cities doing planning in communities. The next question, the third question. I have read Walkable City. Yep, nope, sorta, or yes, and I give it to all my friends. I'm not suggesting you should. So this event is sponsored by Island Press, who published Walkable City Rules, my newer book. I know more people are aware of Walkable City, so I'm curious how many of you have read it. This is not an ad, although I'll be advertising it later, I suppose. Don't worry about hurting my feelings. Okay, so my hope with this talk is to convince more than half of you that you want to hear more from me. Finally, I've read Walkable City Rules. Walkable City Rules is recently out, so don't worry, I won't be hurt with a low number. But I'm curious if some of you, how many of you are aware of the book or know what's in it, so that I can understand that better. And for that majority of you who've tuned in without having read my book, I'm particularly grateful that you're here and wanted to come anyway. Great. Well, 8% is very nice, and I like the sortas. I know how that is. Walkable City was kind of written to be read in pieces. I tell people to keep it in the bathroom so they can read it while seated. And unlike Walkable City, it's it's more of a tool than than just a straight through read. So sorta is a very good answer. So before I go to the show, I just want to tell you about kind of the genesis of this event. I was asked just to give an event based on the book, and it was important to me because I'm kind of tired of giving the same talks, but also because I have a mission. It was important to me to have this subject, specifically walkability studies. I've done about 15 walkability studies since I invented walkability studies a dozen years ago. And I say invented because I came to the idea on my own, but I'm fully aware that other people have also invented the walkability study, and different people do it different ways. So I don't mean to be I don't mean to say I'm the first person to come up with the concept, but in response to a particular challenge that a particular city was facing, I came up with the idea, as I'll show you, to do a walkability study. And then it struck me that that was a really useful scope of work that that more and more cities could use. I do about one of them a year, and they're exhausting for me. They require that you really get to know, at least for the study area, which typically is the downtown core, they require that you really get to know it inside and out. And that generally means knowing maybe 40, 50 streets all at once. I know, for example, in Tulsa, it was 30 miles of streets in the downtown core, block by block by block, and most of them change just about every block. It's really hard work. And I'm actually at a crossroads. I say I'm at a crossroads in my career, but actually I think I've already made the decision. I feel like every city in America needs one of these. Certainly there's 1,000 cities in America that are big enough where a walkability study downtown would really be advantageous to them. And I hope when I'm done, you understand what that is and why. I really was wondering, should I build a big firm around this, or should I team up with some of my partners at the different firms I work with and create, a studio that tries to sell walkability studies to the whole country and the world, or not? And the fact is that it's not my favorite work to do. It's extremely hard, as I said, to learn all the streets. It's incredibly technical. It's not very artistic or creative, and I was trained as an architect and designer, and I prefer doing design work. And it is, it's just not my favorite thing. And so my goal is to get everyone else to do it, because I think that it provides such a benefit to cities. I can show you and will show you examples of cities that have tremendously benefited from it. But if I'm going to make the choice not to do more of these myself, maybe I'll keep doing one a year or fewer. But if I'm going to make the choice to not do them by the dozens, which is what needs to be done, we really need an army of people doing these. And when I say they're hard, I don't mean that they're sophisticated or that they require a particularly deep training. What they really require is some very basic fundamentals and understanding that I'll share today, and a knowledge of the city in which they take place. So my feeling is that cities can do them by themselves, or if you're a private consultant, you can bring it to a bunch of different cities. But I would really like, I'd like to give up the software. I'd like to disseminate the technique and see lots of other people doing it rather than me doing it myself. So with that, I'm going to look for a screen sharing opportunity. Show screen. I believe you can see that, and you can turn my camera off, and I'm going to maximize and go into show mode. And I believe someone can yell at me if this doesn't look right, but I'm hopeful it does. So thank you, Island Press, for helping to sponsor this. And the logo you see at the bottom of the screen is myself and also Nelson Nygaard, because actually I built this talk out of the last walkability study I did, which was in partnership with Nelson Nygaard. So they're going to show up on just about every slide, and they certainly deserve some credit. However, this is a talk from me today. Anything I say that that you don't like, it's only me, it's not them. They had nothing to do with this talk, but they had a lot to do with the walkability study that I'm going to show you. Thank you for coming, and paying back to Island Press, let me share with you that they are offering Walkable City Rules to you all at a 30% discount today, using, or probably subsequent, but get yours today, using the discount code SMART, S-M-A-R-T. And you can go to islandpress.org, O-R-G, and get 30% off of this book. So I used to do walkability studies that were a little more complex because I was using them as a rubric to satisfy all the different things that I like to do with city planning. And if you've read my work, you know that I talk about my general theory of walkability and the way that you get people to walk in the United States, particularly where driving is so, or similar places where driving is so easy and so cheap, is that you have to make the walk as good as the drive, or the bike as good as the drive. And to do that, you need to do 4 things simultaneously. The walk needs to be useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. Now, when you do a downtown master plan, you certainly need to address all of these issues. And as I suggested, my early walkability studies tried to hit all of these 4 categories. But over time, I've really distinguished between what a downtown master plan is and what a walkability study is, and more have just focused on category 2, the safe walk, streets. So a walkability study now I would define as something which is really just looking at the streets within a community. When I arrive in a community to do this work, I tell the people I meet with in the different meetings I have, of which there are many, my goal is to figure out how, as quickly and as cheaply as possible, we can witness the greatest increase in the number of people walking and biking in your downtown. And the study area is almost always the downtown. Now, if you look at this list, you'll see the reason to walk, the comfortable walk and the interesting walk are principally a function of the stuff that's in your downtown and its disposition. So do you have the right mix of uses in your downtown? Do you have a lot of housing in your downtown? And then are those buildings that participate in your downtown, are they comfortable and interesting to walk by? So the comfortable walk is all about shaping space and not having missing teeth or gaps in the streetscape or parking lots in front of your buildings. And the interesting walk is about friendly faces on buildings and hiding your parking garages and not having blank walls and all that sort of stuff. It's very important to make a downtown more attractive and successful. But today's talk and my more recent walkability studies have all been about the safe walk, which is essentially the design of streets. So as a framework for sharing this technique with you, I'm going to be showing you some, but certainly not all, of the 2-hour, it took 2 hours to present it, of the most recent walkability study, which I completed with Nelson Nygaard for downtown Mobile, Alabama, which I think is a somewhat representative American downtown. This project was done with Nelson Nygaard and more specifically with Allison Fletcher. So what you're going to be seeing is the product of our joint effort together, and she deserves a ton of credit for a lot of what you're going to see, and I didn't want to neglect to say that. Downtown Mobile is a lovely place that could be lovelier. The streets are probably the worst part, and not that bad. The worst part of a very nice urban framework. And the first thing I wanted to share with you was kind of the steps I went through before accepting the job. Because when a community calls me up to do something like this, and by the way, as you see in the lower right, the client was the Downtown Mobile Alliance. It, at least initially, was not the city. So there's a number of questions I asked before accepting this kind of work that if you're a private consultant, you should consider. And if you are within the city, you certainly need to consider, which is, why do a plan that won't be implemented, right? There's too many shelf plans in the world. And it's really important to define the client group as broadly as possible before you start the work to make sure that there's buy-in among the different organizations, nonprofits, foundations, major players within the downtown core, make sure that they're willing to participate. But most importantly, particularly if the client isn't the city, is to know that the city has flesh in the game. My biggest question for these guys was, how much will the city participate? How much will public works, can public works be counted on to implement what we're going to propose? How enthusiastic is the mayor, right? How much leadership can we expect from the city council? You don't want to begin this work until you have a sense in the community that there's a ton of people who want to participate in it. And happily for this project, the Downtown Mobile Alliance, at my admonishment, lined all of that up. The process has been very similar for most of these plans that I've done. This one was different because of COVID. I would not have taken this one on remotely. We did it remotely, fully remotely. I would not have taken it on if I didn't already know Mobile very well. My brother lives there. He actually conducts the orchestra. And I've been to Mobile many times and I know these streets. So during COVID, this was the one place I had the opportunity and accepted to do a downtown walkability study remotely. The process was very similar to most of the others we've done. It began with a public lecture in which we introduced the concept and the concepts behind what makes a walkable place. Why is it so important to be walkable? Which more and more cities these days are telling me they don't need to hear. They just say, Jeff, we know it's important to be walkable. Get on to the how. So why it's important to be walkable, and then what makes a place walkable, and take them through that. And then there's usually a single week, and during that week we have the whole morning of 3 or 4, basically 4 days of mornings. Typically, when you're in a place, is meeting after meeting after meeting, and we basically say, who are the people that care? What are the different constituent groups? What are the different branches of city government? What are the different neighborhoods? And you have meetings that are typically an hour to an hour and a half long with each of these. Let's talk to the schools, right? Let's talk to the cyclists. And so those meetings are all lined up. And then typically when you're in a place, you spend every afternoon of that week walking the streets and measuring and pacing and doing that sort of work. And then when you're done, there's a final presentation, which is, here's what we figured out. And that can happen immediately that week. In my old DPZ charrette mode, I try to do everything in a week, right? But it can happen later. And certainly this one was stretched out because it was remote. There's a final presentation where we show what we've done. And then that is all piled together into a report. And the report is structured around what my talk today to you is structured around, which is what are the different parts of a downtown walkability plan. The first is describing and coming to an agreement about what best practices are, and then how are those applied to our streets. You can ignore the interlude, which is not generic. And then it's a big, thick piece of book in which street by street, we propose modifications to the almost entirely striping of the street. There's a few cases where we propose moving curbs, but what makes walkability studies very implementable and not that expensive is that we try to use just paint, right? A new top coat where is necessary, and striping to make these changes. And then I think 10 steps, because there's an introduction and there's priorities. So 10 steps that I'm going to take you through right now about what are the things that we can do, what are the ways that we can change downtown streets to make them more safe, and then every street, how have we changed it? And again, cities can do this internally as well. And so each street ends up with a page like this with a before and an after. Sometimes they're 2 or 3 or 4 pages long, depending on how many segments the street has. That's the second half of the book. The first half of the book is the conversation I'm about to have with you right now. So we're going to march through the 10 things that make downtown safer. But first, of course, you look at safety. You look at where are the injury crashes. And I always look at injury crashes, not just crashes. Often you can have a lot of fender benders in a place that's extraordinarily safe. But what matters are the crashes in which the humans are injured and human life is lost. And you're going to get to know Mobile a little bit during this conversation we're having today. There's one state highway that runs right through the center of downtown, Government Street. It's the widest street, the fastest street, the most heavily trafficked street, and you can see it has a tremendous number of crashes on it. There's also this perimeter that's called the Henry Aaron Loop that is also fast streets, and you can see that it is disproportionately unsafe. And then generally speaking, you have pretty safe intersections within the downtown, and we'll get into some of the details. But you start with this as a guide. Like obviously, if people are getting hurt or dying, that's a very strong motivation for looking at certain streets first and focusing your efforts on those streets. Because this was done by the downtown alliance, they made it very clear, and that's why it's called optimizing streets for safety and business, that the goal was to create a downtown that would thrive, that would be attractive, that wouldn't just be safe, but would compel people to go to it, which of course introduces other priorities like making parking easier where possible, and making the streets more attractive to be on. So those all influence the outcome. And we start with this, in all the work that we do, we start with this incredible, powerful realization that a car going 35 miles an hour is 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. And that difference in speed between 25 and 35 that you see in most city centers is that threshold that you can control by the design of the built environment. And so what are those aspects of the built environment that we can change in order to get the cars going 25 or less, right? 20 is better, rather than higher. And in our plan, as I mentioned, we came up with 10 different things, and here they are. No more driving lanes than we need, lanes that are no wider than they need to be, avoiding multi-lane, particular one-way streets, continuous on-street parking to protect the sidewalk, a useful bike network, fewer center lines and more parking stripes, I'll explain that, few swooping geometries which encourage speeding, few sidewalk curb cuts, no traffic signals that could be all-way stops, and proper crosswalks and beacons. The last one is kind of the most obvious. I put it last because you don't need me to tell you that you're missing crosswalks, but it's still important. It's just obvious. So the first thing you do is what we call under no more driving streets, no more driving lanes than needed, is what we call a lane audit. And the story of my first lane audit is from Oklahoma City, which was the story of my first walkability study, where they were named around 2008, maybe 2010, as the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. And poor Mayor Cornett was like, this can't be right. And in fact, it wasn't right, but that's what they were named. And he came to me, and the downtown really, when I was there, had almost no viable stores in it. It was basically a highway. And he said, what should we do? We're the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. What do we do about that? And I said, let's do a walkability study. And he said, what's that? And I'm like, let's find out together. And the first thing we did was we looked at the car counts, all the car counts in the downtown core, knowing that you can handle 10,000 cars per day in a 2-lane street. And in fact, we determined as our standard in Oklahoma City that any street that had fewer than 10,000 cars per day didn't even get left-hand turn lanes, that they didn't need it. And if you know that, and you look at that, and then you look at the car counts on these streets, these were all streets that were sized 4 to 6 lanes in a recent downtown plan. They were going to be built and rebuilt at that size. And these car counts were astoundingly low. They were 2-lane streets with 4 to 6 lanes. And so the first realization was, and I understand this doesn't happen in every city. In some cities, it's the majority of streets. In some cities, it's just a few. And maybe there's some cities where it's none, but most American cities have some or many streets that have more lanes than even future projections of traffic would say that they need. Now, it so happened that we finished the walkability study just as Devon Energy was about to build this massive tower in the downtown core, which was generating $200 million in tax increment. And they said, what can we spend that on? And we said, how about rebuilding your 40-block downtown core from building face to building face every street? And they said, okay. So it was my job to redesign the curb to curb of all these streets, which I did, and I doubled the amount of on-street parking. I created a bike network where there was no bike network, just because we had all this extra money in the bank, which was this asphalt that wasn't needed. So a typical street goes from 4 lanes to 2. Here it is under construction. This street, the biggest street through the downtown, became this street. And I like to say, this is what you do when you have money. And they had money to spend. And it's interesting, how techniques have changed. This was only about 10 years ago. I would not do a door zone bike lane anymore. But of course, at the time, it was the best practice. And we remade the whole downtown along this model. And it's called a lane audit. So in Mobile, this is the number of travel lanes that you have downtown. this is the traffic volumes. And you have a unique condition here where, except for the highway and the surrounding loop, you don't have a single street in the downtown core carrying more than 5,000 cars per day. So again, you won't find this in every city, but we had tremendous opportunity because a number of these streets were wider than one lane. So great news. We can basically make these streets what we want them to be. So here's the demand. This is based on the car counts, the demand, the number of lanes, and here's the existing lanes. So you compare them back and forth, and you see in red the oversupply of lanes. It's not a ton of lanes because most of these streets are small, but a number of these lanes are extra. And so you have streets like Congress, very light traffic, 4 lanes, Spring Hill Ave, very light traffic, 4 lanes, Washington Avenue with left turn lanes that it doesn't need, and no parking or bike lanes, right? And their main street, Dauphin Street, which to the west half of the city is a 2-lane one-way, which only needs to be 1 lane, which would allow parking on both sides, which is currently a struggle for the businesses that you can't park on both sides. Or it could be made 2-way, right? So that's the oversupply of lanes. That is money in the bank. Let's use it. Second, lanes of the proper width. We know that the wider your lanes are, the faster people will drive. The faster people drive, the more people die. So we want the lanes to be narrower, and 10 feet is the standard. It used to be 10. It has crept up in many cities to 12. And now I'm talking about busy streets. I'm talking about heavily trafficked commercial streets, not small residential streets, which we'll talk about in a minute. But NACDO, thank goodness for NACDO, makes it very clear. If it's a bus lane, maybe you need 11 feet, but 10 feet is the standard. And we can build our cities out of 10-foot lanes. Moreover, for residential neighborhoods, there's the yield street or the queuing street standard. This is from Portland in the 1990s, but most of our cities have older streets which are residential, in which about 12 to 14 feet is handling 2-way traffic between parked cars. Absolutely standard. I'll show you some in Mobile. And that's the model then for low volume, lower density streets. So you see those, for example, here in Washington, not here, but in this picture in Washington, D.C., a busy street that I live near. And then here in Mobile, next to my brother's house, which is off screen here, you have one of these streets. It's about 26 feet wide. You're allowed to park on both sides. This is a classic neighborhood street, and that is fine for 2-way if it's low volume. And this is what what it looks like when you just draw it up. So using the 10-foot model for the more downtown streets, you take your Google ruler and you measure streets like Congress in this section, which is a 3-lane section, no parking allowed, so it should be 30 feet, but you can see it's 45 feet. So you've got 15 feet of extra pavement to do something with. Here's Washington Street in another section, not the 3-lane segment. This is the principal part of Washington Avenue, should be 20 feet wide, but it's 30 feet wide and parking isn't allowed. You have 15-foot lanes. This is a street that they are rebuilding, and they're rebuilding it with extended curbs and other things, but they're rebuilding it based on a 12-foot lane plus gutter pan. So they're rebuilding it faster than they need to. And so we proposed actually, as part of the eventual plans, to narrow the 24-foot to 20-foot, right? And then you have 2 different types of one-ways in Mobile. Mobile, almost every street in the downtown is 1-way because most of them are quite skinny, but there's 2 different types. They're the ones that have a lot of traffic on them, and so too tight probably to introduce 2-way traffic back to them because there'd be a lot of conflicts, but they still have an extra 6 or 7 feet. It's probably 16, 17 feet from curb to parked car. So a lot of those where cars are going faster than they need to, but also there's no bike facilities where there could be. And then secondarily, you have streets like Dearborn that I showed you where my brother lives, where it's a 1-way, but it has very light traffic and it looks like those 2-ways that could be 2-way streets because very few people are driving on them in the residential neighborhoods, low density. So those are available as well. So that extra pavement is money in the bank that can be used for 2-way traffic, and it can be used for parking and for bike facilities. 3 one-way streets. Now, multi-lane one-way streets in particular are tremendously unsafe. And of course, a lot of cities have these multi-lane one-way pairs There aren't that many of them in Mobile, but they are places that are less safe. There's been a ton of data collected on these. I'm only going to give you the tip of the iceberg, but I like to cite this particular study from Louisville, where of these 4 streets, Brook, First, Second, and Third, Brook and First were reverted to 2-way, Second and Third were kept as 1-way. On the 2-ways, car crashes dropped by almost half, and even crime went down, and we had the opposite experience on the 1-way streets. And there's just so much data now supporting this, this conclusion that people speed on multi-lane 1-way streets because of the opportunity to jockey, because there's just so many lanes in one direction, and just because it feels like a piece of highway. This is downtown Cedar Rapids, where I was hired not too long after Oklahoma City to do a plan without a big budget. And it was eventually accomplished over about 7 years of resurfacing and restriping that was going to happen anyway. So here in the downtown core, they just had typically 4-lane streets, and half of them were 1-ways. And here's how we changed the traffic network, changing all the 1-ways to 2-way, and cutting the number of lanes typically from 4 to 2. So this is the parking existing and the parking after, where red is angle and orange is parallel. This is the bike system before and the bike system after, what we were able to do. And they finally finished it without dedicating any extra budget to it, in conjunction with their restripings. And a typical street went from this to this. This is like the first day. So this fellow over here on the left had not yet learned how to park next to a protected buffered bike lane, but you get the idea. So a lot of neighborhoods, particularly when you have the chance to explain it to them, they begin to understand why they want their 2-way streets made back into 1-way streets. This is New Albany, Indiana, where with Nelson Nygaard years ago, I proposed this complete reversion from what was all 1-way streets to 2-way streets in their downtown core. And they sat on it for about 2.5 years, and then they did it all in one summer. The reason they sat on it is they were really worried about public safety. They were worried, would it work? Would there be horrible congestion? And I had the pleasure of going back there 2 years ago, and the police chief spoke to the Congress for New Urbanism and said he had never seen a better scenario for public safety. Speeds have been reduced, crashes are down, response times are better. There is no city that I'm aware of, please let me know if I'm wrong, that regrets converting their multi-lane 1-ways back to 2-way. And this is a list from Walkable City Rules of the cities that I'm aware of that's done it, that have done it. And there's no reason not to do it. In this case, in Mobile, you had a couple big streets, St. Joseph and St. Anthony, which are 1-way multi-laners. You also have Dauphin, but Dauphin wanted parking on both sides. So we chose not to do the conversion on Dauphin. But St. Joseph was already underway. The city was investigating it, and we just confirmed their work. St. Anthony is the other one. And then you have all these small neighborhood streets that look like my brother's street, which were 1-way and could be 2-way. So St. Joseph, 1-way clearly could be 2-way and fit it. St. Anthony, same thing. You notice we're doing slightly narrower travel lanes, which the City Public Works Department is comfortable with. We're doing some 8-foot lanes on the less downtown parts of the downtown. And then you have all of these little streets that are the lightly traveled 2-ways exist on just a few of them, like Dearborn, but there's a whole bunch of others that could be 2-way, and the plan does that. So that's that. Next, as I plow through, continuous on-street parking. Parallel parking, if you're trying to get rid of cars in your city, if you're trying to be Paris and try to be green, and God knows we all should be, sipping my water, then yes, your long-term goal in your city should be to get rid of parking just like you want to get rid of driving. However, in the typical American city, in which, particularly downtown core, in which parking is prized and parking supports businesses, we look to parking much more as a protector of the sidewalk. On-street parking delivers people to their destinations, but not immediately in front of those destinations. So it creates pedestrian activity. And really, you don't want to be on a sidewalk next to vehicles if there is not parallel parking on that sidewalk edge. This is Fort Lauderdale, where I did a walkability study. and asked, why can't we park on this side of him or she Boulevard during happy hour? Here's happy hour on the park side of the street, and on the right is happy hour on the unparked side of the street, because nobody wants to sit or walk or be 3 feet from cars going 40 miles an hour. We've reinstituted the parking on this curb, and of course now there's a viable business instead of this one that failed in that location. So you had a lot of instances, notice the car parked in the no parking zone. You have a lot of streets in downtown like MLK, which have enough room on them for parking. In fact, this one has an extra lane it doesn't need as well, but they aren't parked on legally. So it's very easy to change that street from what's currently 3 or 4 lanes of just driving to have parking on both flanks, making it much more viable for businesses and for residents. I already mentioned Washington Avenue to you with the 15-foot lanes. We made the parking 9 feet wide just to make this as narrow as we could. Beyond 10 feet of parking space just looks wrong. Dauphin Street, we mentioned. The interesting thing about Dauphin is that it becomes narrower right here, actually after this crash. And you can see that all the crashes, it becomes 1 lane eastbound, just west of Cathedral Square. You notice the 2-lane area is where all the crashes are, all the injuries are. And of course, these merchants are trying to have a viable business when they expect someone to sit there with their back to this car going 40 on this 2-lane raceway. And here we had a problem where the fire chief was concerned that on this very busy commercial street that he maintain his 20-foot clear to be able to put down his truck, in fact, 18 feet, with its stabilizers to get to a fire. And this was his truck. And we said, what if we come back and we put in parking spaces, but we put a little gap between each parking space so that you can fit in the 14 feet, you can fit the truck, but also have room for the stabilizer. And I'd be misleading you if I said that he said that was fine, but I believe the mayor believes it's fine, and that's the direction in which we're heading. Their concern is fighting building fires. So I made a point of talking about the crashes in the community and did the research and found out that at least nationally where there's data, car crash injuries outrank building fire injuries by a ratio of 180 to 1. So I agree that life safety and fire safety are important, but if you're concerned about life safety, you should be 180 times more concerned about cars speeding than you should be about where you park your truck. So we'll give you some slots for your stabilizers, but please keep this ratio in mind. So that's that proposal. A useful bike network. I could spend all day on this. I won't. But this is the trickiest part, because you need to jockey what's possible on the different streets with the demand for parking on different streets, with the goals of reverting one-ways to two-way, but then having a bike network that still gets you to most of the destinations in the downtown, or get you close to all the destinations in the downtown, one way or another. And of course, what we've learned from Portland and other cities is it's those cities that invest in bike infrastructure, that get bike infrastructure. It's a hard sell in many communities that have limited biking, like Mobile, to tell them that, you build it, they will come, right? I've heard that before. But in fact, with bike lanes, it isn't just that. You have to build enough of them so that it's safe and comfortable to bike usefully throughout the downtown. And once you cross that threshold, and only once you cross it, will people make the choice to bike. Of course, the new standard is not the in-traffic bike lane, but the protected bike lane, like this one you see on Prospect Park West in New York City. Jeanette Sadiq-Khan has great data for this street about how, of course, speeding dropped precipitously and injuries dropped precipitously, but a 3-laner became a 2-laner, and yet there's just as much traffic being handled on the street after as before, because people were just speeding from red light to red light previously. So I like to show this image and contrast it with this one, right, which actually is the daughter of Heather Boyer of Island Press, who posed for this image because the version I had was not available for purchase. But here's putting her daughter at risk. No one wants their daughter in the door zone, right? When you can have this solution instead. And of course, when you expose your bike lanes, people are always putting stuff in them, often ridiculous things in the bike lanes. So you really need to protect them as much as possible. And you need to remind people that investment in bike infrastructure is investment in equity, because fully 39% of the people who are biking to work in your community are of the poorest 25% of income earners. And so, you know, bike lanes are an investment in that part of the population, which does not include the mayor of Mobile, but it's always good to have a picture of him on a bike when you're proposing something. And I'm not going to take you through the whole network that we proposed, but the idea was to put bike lanes where they would fit, but where they also get you where you need to go. It's worth mentioning that all of these soon to be two-way, and by the way, the city, if I forget to mention it later, the city is moving forward quickly with implementation, but all these soon to be two-way narrow residential streets are perfectly bikeable. So that's a big part of the bike network. But coming from the south, Washington Street is super important. And then east-west is much more of a challenge because there are very few east-west streets, almost none, that are slow traffic. And you can just mix with the cars like you can on these streets. And so that became more of the challenge. And we introduced bike lanes of different types. First of all, they were building currently around on Broad Street, really this whole section here, they're already building a cycle track in a rebuild outside of the street. So that's fantastic. They've also reduced the number of lanes on Water Street, which is this eastern street, and also on Canal. And because they had too many lanes and they had no bike facilities, so they put in these bike lanes that were originally promised to have barriers, and they never put the barriers in. And there's some legal tie-up that we're trying to work around for putting something in the bike lanes that will protect them. But of course, our plan proposes that they do that stat to Water Street and Government Street, put objects in the buffer, and only then will these become usable bike lanes. You know, I would not bike on this lane right now, and I'm comfortable biking. And then there's streets like Washington that I mentioned, which have 3 lanes where they don't need to. And so there's an opportunity to connect to the south with bike lanes on either side of the street. Spring Hill continues Washington to the north, and that's this massive one that can become this, right? It's the same dimension. Spring Hill can become Cedar Rapids and have protected bike lanes along it like that. That's up in here. So you have this connection on the west end of downtown. And then, you know, looking for places where they can fit, where they still are pretty well dispersed. Congress, I showed you with its extra lanes. But then you have all these one-ways I told you about that we can't make two-way because they have too much traffic on them for two-way. You can't fit two-way traffic in 15 feet. So you'd have to lose the parking, which these people aren't willing to do. But you can fit a bike lane in there. Notice not in the door zone, right? On the other side of the street, you can fit a bike lane in. So all of these, and there's like 7 or 8 of them in the downtown, one ways that we're going to keep as one way because we need to, but we can insert the bike lane on the other side of the street from the parked cars. Those are these streets through here. Sorry, it's St. Francis, Conti, and then these 4 streets, Franklin, Claiborne, Joachim, and Conception. So there's all of those. And then, yeah, St. Michael, I mentioned, that's one of them. Conti is another one. Same idea. Then there's Congress, which I mentioned. We found a cyclist on it that only needs 2 lanes. So of course, here you have a tremendous opportunity to turn a lane into a buffer and a bike lane where there's no real parking demand. So that's easy. And that's here. But as it heads east, it narrows. And so we had to split it and put the westbound bike lane only in Congress and the eastbound only in State. And we did that. So here are the narrower parts where these residents were complaining about speeding on their streets. And we asked them, do you want bike lanes or do you want more parking? And they said, we want bike lanes. So State and Congress get bike lanes. And notice the slow flow geometry, 17 feet for travel in both ways. Easy to do when you have a bike lane here, so that if a truck meets a truck, they look to make sure they're not hitting a cyclist and they just swing a little bit. And that's something that happens in cities and it's okay. Better to have those narrow lanes for slower speeds. So that's that part. And I could take you through the whole thing, but let's move on. Fewer center lines, more parking stripes. I'll do this in 20 seconds. A study in London found that when you remove center lines from arterial roads, people's speeds drop by a nominal 7 miles an hour. So let's do that, right? So whenever we're proposing a new street, we propose it without a center line. Also, though, we want to mark the parking and mark the bike lane very pointedly, because that does constrict the sense of the amount of area that you have to be in. Having no center line means you have no confidence that the guy coming at you won't hit you. And while that may be a little less comfortable as a driver, that makes you a slower and safer driver. So you remove the center line, yet you constrict the street with other lines, and you're going to have the slowest outcome you can for driving. Few swooping geometries. Swoops imply high speeds. Swoops welcome high speeds. Swoops make places not look very pedestrian or feel pedestrian, and drivers don't act like it's a pedestrian place. A lot of cities are closing their slip lanes. This is Midtown Atlanta, where they've closed this slip lane, and wisely so. So you can't get around the corner without being subject to the rule of the traffic controlling device. And you see the pedestrians, much less likely to hit them. So we identified a couple places in the downtown core where slip lanes exist and don't need to. There's no reason why turning motions onto this super wide street by a super long truck cannot make it around this corner without the slip lane. And then this is a street, actually St. Louis, that's being rebuilt. So if you're rebuilding the street, you just rebuild it without the slip lanes. This is an intersection that's on the way, the northeast corner of the downtown, the massive intersection with the interstate, that there's a plan to restripe it and move some of the curbs a little bit. And here's the plan to restripe it, but it maintains slip lane and doesn't have good bicycle facilities, even though all the streets that approach it have bicycle facilities on them. So we, with Nelson Nygaard, did a redesign that both introduced specific bicycle markings, but also closed the slip lane, right? This slip lane here is gone. This slip lane here is gone, to make it as safe as possible for what's a pretty unsafe intersection. And then there's, in any of these plans, there's certain problem areas and opportunities that you can identify where things are just super swoopy. For some reason, the fact that these streets pass under a highway led to the Public Works Department designing it like it was a highway. And so you have super swoopy curves, super swoopy slip lanes, 14-foot lanes going underneath the highway. Really, everything's wrong with this collection of streets. And so here we did one of our site-specific interventions, right? Call it an intervention, in which you use that epoxy gravel solution to tighten up the roadway, eliminate the slip lane, add parking to make it 20 feet across. Similarly here, right? No parking, parking. Of course, we worked on the crosswalks, and then these streets coming in, elsewhere in the report, we described how they have 2 lanes each when they only need 1, and they're actually what's needed to complete that bike network on the Hank Aaron Loop around the city. So you get the idea. You can do interventions like this, and of course, if you want to see great examples of those built, just go to New York City, Madison Square, and Times Square as well. So I talked to the city about the way that you can do temporary, less expensive interventions like this one in Chicago to neck down the space and make it slower speed. So that's that. A huge problem in Tulsa, which was the previous study that Allison and I did together, less so in Mobile, is where you have parking lots up against the street, and they have curb cuts for every single aisle, even though they may be internally connected. And the experience of being on those streets is that you basically lose the sidewalk, right? The sidewalk becomes a continuous skirt of parking. And not only is that uncomfortable, but it adds to the lack of safety as cars are pulling in and out across you. So we talked to the city about focusing on this one area when they do rebuild or resurface, to consolidate curb cuts, to make people make the turn from lane to lane within the lot and not on the street, right? So you don't have curb cut, curb cut, curb cut, curb cut. Not a big problem in Mobile, but a big problem in a lot of cities that we've worked in. No traffic signals that could be always stops. Philadelphia did a study. I'm aware of lots of other anecdotal evidence. This is the only big study that I'm aware of, but the study made it very clear that when you replace a signal with an always stop, you make intersections tremendously safer, because everyone sees everyone else. There's eye contact. No car that is not breaking law is ever going through that intersection at more than 5 miles an hour because they've stopped as they've entered it, right? I think this is Eugene, Oregon, where I took this. But this is the good city, right? This is an environment in which, the pavers help, but this is an environment in which everyone's looking at everyone else. Everyone is welcome. Differently abled people are particularly favored by these circumstances. And whenever you can replace a signal with an always stop sign, you can. And the issue in Philadelphia is that the 472 signals were not warranted, and they were forced by law to remove them. Most cities and states don't do that. But if an intersection does not have a ton of traffic on it, like basically all the intersections here that aren't with the state highway, that aren't on the Hank Aaron loop, none of them need to have signals. And the unfortunate thing is they need to do a bunch of studies to confirm what's perfectly obvious as we move forward. But we're all very confident that this is the existing signalization and stop signs in the downtown. This is our proposal, which basically is retaining the traffic signals on the busy highways. It's replacing, I think, 21 signals with always stops. And that's the main thing you need to know. So this was Albuquerque, where I did a previous walkability study. And wherever you see, I think there's 17 here, proposals for replacing based on the amount of traffic on each street, and where lower traffic streets met lower traffic streets, replacing signals with always stops. And what happened was they didn't do all of them. I believe they did 11 of them, and they did 11 of them, and then people complained because that people don't like change, and some people didn't like it, and so they pulled out some of them and put the stop signs back. And then the complaints were, put the signals back. Then the complaints were even louder, and people said, no, those stop signs, A, made us feel safer, and B, made traffic flow more smoothly. And this is from the local news station. City reinstalls downtown stop signs to reduce traffic pileup as well as speeding, because you may be stopping at every intersection on Gold Avenue, but you're never sitting waiting at a light. And the outcome has been clearly demonstrated by traffic engineers that a downtown with always stops is actually faster to get through than one that has signals. So there's all the reason to do it. And Albuquerque was an example of being proved right eventually after being thought wrong. And then finally, proper crosswalks and beacons. We inspire people with unusual, illegal in the US crosswalks that should be legal. But when you're doing a plan like this, you look for the places where people are crossing. This is the new plan for that street that I showed you that has the cycle track on it. And it's being planned with a raised little barrier in the middle and no crossing at this street where a lot of people cross. And so you bring that up and you say, how can you fix that? And you make a proposal that welcomes bike traffic and pedestrian traffic across the street by shortening this very, very, very long center turn lane. This did not fly initially, and we can't get this to happen right away, unfortunately, because it was determined that this lane couldn't get any shorter because traffic flow trumps human safety. But lots of other good things are going our way in this plan. Here is an important intersection, a T intersection where Conti, which is a dozen blocks long, ends on Royal Street, and there's no crossing there. And so, of course, there's a place where the report specifically recommends you need to put a crossing in. And then we look at where the injuries and the accidents are, and this incredible blight of Government Street, which is a state DOT, and the state DOT is cooperative and is wanting to work with us, but has allowed over the years for this primary street in the downtown core for example, to have intersections with no crosswalks. And if you arrive here as a pedestrian, you are going to jaywalk, because the alternative is to walk 300 feet to the left or 250 feet to the east or to the west. and people won't do that. There's also a lot of signalized intersections that only have crosswalks on one arm. And of course, people cross anyway without the crosswalk being there. So of course, the plan admonishes them to very quickly put those crossings in, to put those additional signals in as fast as they can. And then you have this one location where everyone's getting hit. And the reason that's happening is because people are coming out of a tunnel. They're coming out of a tunnel right here, and they're surfacing, and they're trying to turn from the tunnel lanes into this street, even though they're not allowed to. And there's little pylons there to stop you. And also pedestrians are extremely threatened in this location. So we made a proposal for the city to consider that doesn't inhibit any of the turning motions except the illegal one, by extending flags a little further, right, beyond the crosswalk, and then putting in these little islands to give pedestrian refuge with ballers, to give pedestrian refuge so when they do cross with the people speeding out of the tunnel and into the tunnel in this location, they'll be a little less threatened. So that's everything. And but that's not where the report stops, because of course, you've given them hundreds and hundreds of things to change, millions of dollars to spend. And so there needs to be a final part, which is priorities. So let's identify what the priorities are, and let's tell you that these are the marching orders if you want to have the most impact as quickly as possible. So first of all, there's Government Street, where if you spend enough time on Google Maps, you find images like this, which are just scary about what's happening on that street. And so the first thing is that we need to jumpstart, the bureaucratic process to get those intersections fixed and that striping fixed. Secondly is work already happening. I told you that this intersection was being redesigned. Okay, let's make sure the redesign incorporates the changes in this report. I told you St. Louis Street is being rebuilt with those curb extensions. Let's rebuild it to 20 feet and not to 24 feet. They happen to be revising, I didn't show you this one, but this is one of the streets they're restriping from one-way to two-way, and it's wide enough to have angle parking. They were just planning to do parallel. We're like, no, it's wide enough, and people will go slower if it's parallel and angle. I mentioned the intersection. Here's another one that are currently being rebuilt. Then the big chunk, which the city is excited to start quickly, is all that two-way reversion and signal elimination. And by the way, I didn't spend enough time saying this, but a big reason why we can change signals to stop signs is because the traffic is being reverted from 2 lanes in one direction to 2 directions, right? When you have 2 lanes in the same direction arriving at a always stop sign, it can be a bit confusing, and cities generally don't like to do that. But when you change it to 2 lanes in 2 directions, one lane in each direction, then that always stop becomes possible. So doing the reversion of the streets and the 21 signals that can be stop signs all at once is one really big step that will have a huge impact quickly. And you can see what all of that looks like. And then the changes that I already discussed with the stop signs. And then a foundational bike plan. So we showed you the whole bike plan, but let's prioritize it and let's talk about what we can do quickly and will have the most impact. So the other bike plan, you'll recall, has a lot more in it than this, but these are the ones that we can stripe first and create that foundation for biking in the downtown. And then Dauphin Street, the way the merchants are suffering from the fire department's mandate of only one-sided parking. So that's another high priority item. And that's how we ended the plan. And that's kind of how I'm ending my talk to you. But I do want to, as usual, end the talk with a list of resources for you to consider. Those of you who haven't read Walkable City, I ask you to read the first couple pages. And if you are not compelled to keep reading, then stop. But the reason that this book's done so well is because it's really fun to read, and it's a great way to share ideas in your community. Secondly, for you guys, because you're mostly professionals, everything I discussed today, except for the details about Mobile and specific to Mobile, everything I discussed today is in my new book, Walkable City Rules. If you are going to take it upon yourself to do a walkability study, which is one of the steps, I think it might be step 98, if you're going to take it upon yourself to do this kind of work, I created this book for you to help you do that. And it's 101 rules. Each one is 2 pages of one of these things that I told you about today. Discount code SMART at islandpress.org. If you don't have the patience to read, or maybe you just don't need to, I have 2 TED Talks that are both just 15 minutes long. So you go to TED.com and you look up my name. One is why it's so important to make more walkable cities, and the other is a lot like today's. But if, I would say, because we've been through this together, I didn't discuss any of this today. I didn't discuss any of the why. You already know all this from the conversation we had today, but if you want to share these ideas with other people who only have 15 or 16 minutes, this is the talk to do it with. My website is available with all kinds of resources on it. It's jeffspeck.com, and it's got projects and videos and other things. And then finally, particularly for this crowd, we took a year off, soon to be 2 years off, but June of next year, I will start again teaching my 2-day class at Harvard University every summer. So it's 2 days in Cambridge of this stuff. And it includes site visits and with George Proakis of Somerville, who's fantastic, and a studio exercise, and it's for everybody. And it's not cheap, and of course you've got to get yourself to Cambridge, but when you're done, you get a diploma that makes it look like you went to Harvard. So I tell people it's worth every penny. And then finally, just again, ending with my website where you can access all of these things. So I am done, and I'm happy to see I've left almost half an hour for Q&A. So I'm going to stop my share, and hopefully this will allow me to see you again, or for you to see me. So let me close my window here. I'm trying, there we go.
And we do have a couple more. Jeff, we do have the polls here that I think you wanted to close.
Yeah,
with.
so I added a few more poll questions for the end. So let's ask those. I am in a position where I can initiate a walkability study, extra space, in my community. Yes, no, good question. And good question means I haven't thought about it much, and I might want to think about it. Not included in this question is, I think it would be a good idea. Well, maybe that's implied by the next question. I can't remember what the next question is. Oh, and I can share my webcam so you can see me. Can you guys see me now?
Well, we have the poll results up now, which is 39% said, good question.
A third.
Yep.
Great.
Interesting. There you are.
Next question. If yes, I mean, why not ask this, right? If yes, I am going to initiate a walkability study in my community. Yes, soon, probably before too long. Someday, I hope, or forget about it. And there's no judgment here. I'm just curious how this landed.
And I'll tell you that we literally got hundreds of questions here, so we'll get to them as soon as we're here.
Yes, soon is 15%. Probably before too long is 15%. Someday, I hope, is the vast majority, and only 3%. That makes me happy, because it means that there's at least an interest among everyone, right? All but 3% of you like the idea. So I'm asking this just for personal interest. Jeff should grow a huge firm to spread walkability studies worldwide. Remember, I told you I don't want to do that. Follow his bliss and do urban design instead, or move to Hollywood and chase his dream. The third one is a joke. I don't want to, well, who doesn't want to be on the silver screen? But no, the real choice is between number 1 and number 2.
It's interesting to see a little bit of change, the results coming in.
But I've been talking to friends of mine, in big firms and, just brainstorming it. Thank you. Okay, so I appreciate that some people want me to continue this good work. I appreciate that most of you are giving me the freedom to direct my career the way I want it to go. So thank you for that. So I would love to hear questions, and are you guys curating them, or how's this working?
Yes, yeah, it's Michael, and I'll give them to you. So we have got a lot of questions about your opinions on roundabouts. What do you think about that, and whether that's a solution at all?
Thank you. So one of the rules in walkable city rules is use roundabouts with discretion, or something like that. Roundabouts are great for safety, no doubt. They are a great choice for almost every location except the heart of a walkable downtown, where you want to have a feeling of stasis and comfort. The problem is they're swoopy and they're automotive, and they communicate automotive motion. They also require pedestrians to walk off axis, sometimes 20 to 60 feet off axis to get where they're trying to go. And they're not good for cycling. If you have higher speed traffic and you're a cyclist entering a roundabout, you can be rather confused and in danger. But at lower speeds, right? So I work for Mayor Brainerd in Carmel, Indiana. They've got like 120 roundabouts now. Any possible experiment you want to conduct about roundabouts, they've already done. And they've got them in all sorts of different great locations, including one that's kind of at the western end of the main street of the Art and Design District. And that's okay where it is, because it's kind of where that district ends. I would not put it in the center of that district. We did a downtown master plan when I was at DPZ for Sarasota that was hugely successful, but which they violated a little bit and put 2 roundabouts right on the main street in the downtown. And they're okay, they're safe, but they make it feel less like a main street. The way I like to put it is that roundabouts are the safest, most pedestrian friendly automotive environment that you can create. So if you've given up on being something other than an automotive environment, go right ahead. But when I use them in projects, I put them on the perimeter and on the edge of where I want my always stop signs in my downtown core.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. We got a couple of comments about how Mobile is both in the south and fairly flat. How would some of these rules apply in areas that have to deal with snow removal and or a little bit more topography?
So I think, studying San Francisco or other incredibly walkable places like Mykonos or Ibiza or Quebec City or Beacon Hill would demonstrate that steep topography, San Miguel de Allende, steep, you close my camera, but I'd like people to see me talk if that's, yeah, I'll open it up again. Steep topography is really no impediment to walkability. Now, it's an impediment to accessibility, and we have to care about that. And obviously, in the US, satisfying ADA and doing everything you can to welcome all people is super important. But in the context of this question, the evidence makes it clear that topography is not an impediment to getting lots of people to walk, period. Now, snow removal, I've dealt with the full range of snow removal challenges. I did a plan for Butte, Montana, where actually, very interesting, they tent the snow in the middle of the street, and that's where they have to put it. And when you're doing a plan for a city like that, you kind of can't do protected bike lanes easily. First of all, during the snowy season, almost no one's biking in a place like Butte, which is also super hilly. Secondly, you need extra room in the streets to tent the snow. So actually integrated bike lanes, unfortunately in the door zone, but integrated bike lanes are a great way to deal with snow tenting because they make the street wider in a way that hopefully doesn't encourage speeding, because it's a bike lane in the non-snow season and it's a snow tenting in the snow season. Otherwise, there's a million examples of northern places with snow issues, like most of New England, where I spend my time, where the streets are just as skinny as anywhere else. The skinnier a street is, the less you have to plow. Clearly, the parking lane is a snow placement lane. Most of our communities have no parking during snow emergency bans. And, you know, the real issue with snow is like having places to push it. And that's why parking lanes can be so effective. But the idea of having extra width in the driving area itself for snow is not something that's traditionally been the case. It was funny at the beginning of that question to hear it, because of course what I got in Mobile was, oh, of course people will bike in colder places where they aren't sweaty, but here it's too hot to bike. But almost everywhere where there's biking, you know, the weather isn't ideal. In Portland, it rains almost every day, and that's a biking capital. So I wouldn't discount people's willingness to bike in bad weather, and certainly in the cold.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Here's another question. How do you convince an engineer who doesn't feel comfortable about putting crosswalks at an uncontrolled intersection to do so?
So I'd like to tell you I've done that, but I probably haven't. And every engineer is different. Every situation is different. And I am actually not, I'll be absolutely honest with you and tell you where my knowledge ends. As we were doing this study, a question I asked to my colleagues at Nelson Nygaard was, when you've got a really busy street like Government Street through the heart of Mobile, and you have no signal, should you put a crosswalk there? You know, what's the threshold? 4-lane street, 3-lane street, 5-lane street? At what point? Because clearly, if people are going to cross there, then having the crosswalk does make it safer because they're visible if they're going to cross there. If there's a way to get them to not cross there, then you should do that if there's no way to put a signal in. There's a certain width at which it's just too wide, period. So clearly, if that street, let's just say, was 7 lanes wide with no signal, I just wouldn't feel safe putting in crossing. I think this data exists. I just don't have it. There's some width and speed at which you clearly shouldn't, and there's some width and speed at which you clearly should. The technique that we used for Mobile was that they should not put in the crosswalks on that street, on Government Street, because it's 5 lanes. They should not put in the crosswalks until they get pedestrian activated signals. And I actually proposed a sign that would go on each of those corners I showed you that said, to cross, go 200 feet west to blank street. Whether or not that's going to work, I don't know. But you know, I'm not so much interested in convincing as I am in finding the answer to this question. You know, what is the threshold at which an unsignalized crosswalk, which at least calls the driver's attention to the pedestrians, is safer than having nothing there at all? And I don't know the answer.
Thanks. Here's a question from Fred Manna, who's asking, what is your opinion of reverse angle parking versus common angle parking?
I have a lot of fun with that one, and I showed you a drawing that, as I showed it to you during my talk, I'm sure a lot of you were thinking, what? Jeff's doing front in angle parking? Because of course, reverse angle parking is much safer. So the data is very clear that front angle parking is more dangerous than back angle parking, but the data that I'm aware of is most meaningful surrounding cycling. There was one study done in Tucson where they had front angle parking along the street, and bicyclists were literally being hit monthly if not weekly. They're being hit regularly by cars. And they changed it to reverse angle like 6 years ago, and there hasn't been one crash since. So the first thing I do is I keep bikes away from front angle parking. Like if I've got a bike system and an angle parking system, I keep them apart from each other. Secondarily, I advocate for rear angle parking wherever I can. And some cities like Austin or Washington, D.C. or others are open to it, and others aren't. You need to read your audience and just understand what's possible. Rear angle is better, but you know, you push for it and you push for it, and you may or may not get it.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Next question here is saying, parking is obviously a hot topic, and many would argue that there's an oversupply of parking in downtown areas. In reclaiming curb-to-curb pavement away from travel lanes into parking, have you seen downtown redevelopment spurred in areas where on-street parking was added and the necessity for off-street parking decreases?
I don't have the data beyond the fact that both the National Trust for Historic Preservation, with a low value of I think about 15 grand, and the retail expert Bob Gibbs, who wrote the book Urban Retail, with a high value of I think 150 grand, put a price on each on-street parking space, saying this parking space, what the National Trust said was this parking space generates $15,000 in revenues for nearby businesses, and everyone you add adds more revenue, and everyone you take away diminishes revenue. I think that's an extremely superficial way of looking at it, and you know, more valuable than any one particular space is having a good downtown parking plan and parking system and good wayfinding, so that people just have comfort that they'll be able to find a spot. When a city has enough demand, of course, to have parking congestion, then you need to get into the pricing discussion. And I imagine everyone on this webinar has heard about Donald Shoup and the high cost of free parking. But the biggest problem we have in our cities around parking is just that it's priced improperly. And so it functions extremely inefficiently. And in some downtowns, you know, 80% of the traffic is people circling to find parking spaces on street that are underpriced, while parking elsewhere is overpriced. So, you know, I think this is such a city by city discussion. I know certainly that in COVID days and in response to, you know, specific opportunities that we've had during COVID, where parking spaces have been replaced by on-street dining has increased revenue to businesses. And I think there are certainly locations where the removal of parking can increase revenue, and even where pedestrianizing streets properly and taking cars off them entirely can increase revenue. Certainly the data from New York City and elsewhere shows that adding bike lanes will increase revenue. And probably the biggest thing that I would retract from Walkable City would be my suggestion that we shouldn't replace on-street parking in downtown cores with bike lanes, because I think, you know, the data now shows that bikers are much better spenders than drivers. So it's always a balancing act, and often, again, you know, the perfect is the enemy of the good, and you have to know what's possible with the merchants and push the merchants as far as you can. But having a good balance of biking and parking is somewhere in there is the answer.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Adam Peterson, who's saying, I'm a statistician who works on issues modeling the built environment and its impact on human health. I'm wondering what kinds of relationships I could develop models for that would best assist answering the questions in this space. I'm getting a sense that a street-specific propensity to walk would be an outcome of interest, examining how this propensity varies as a function of proximity to population, street features, and so on. Can you give me your ideas on this and any other ideas that might be related?
Well, any number of people have tried to create walkability indexes and correlate them with other variables. You're probably mostly aware of WalkScore, that really fun website that determines the walkability of any address in the US and elsewhere. That is a truly flawed algorithm in that all it's really measuring is what you're near. Now, it so happens that the places where you're near a lot of different things, like coffee and shopping and groceries, tend to also be the places where which were designed before World War II and therefore are quite walkable. So they kind of lucked into the fact that all the other aspects that add up to walkability, like the width of the lanes, the number of lanes, the width of the sidewalks, the presence of street trees, the presence of parallel parking, all those other things tend to co-correlate with the sort of prior design practices in which mixed use was really a big part, right? So WalkScore is still pretty accurate. People have used WalkScore, as I talk about in Walkable City. They've correlated WalkScore against real estate values. They've done lots of other things to show how important walkability is to so many different things. And they've also looked at there's been any number of studies correlating walkability and health. The main advice I would give to a statistician in this space is that almost any study I see done, many of which I cite and many of which I use to my advantage, almost all of them are probably as much correlation as they are causation. And you really have to look at wealth. You have to look at the wealth category because so many things just co-correlate with wealth and poverty. So, oh, more trees makes a place healthier. Well, more trees is a richer place, and a richer place has healthier people in it, right? So, I mean, there's all these slip-ups that you can do by ignoring the wealth aspect of the equation. But I would direct you to doing longitudinal studies because principally for that reason, like there are the easiest way to avoid making the mistake of mistaking correlated causation is to look at a place where a change has happened. And there's so much advice. And again, if you're concerned about car crashes should be a huge concern, there's so much evidence before and after about how street modifications have reduced the number of traffic injuries. I would send you in that direction. But then also looking at how places change over time when the streets are made safer, as opposed to comparing different geographical places where between wealth and density, you can pretty much account for any difference in the data that you collect.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. We are having some issues of lag here occasionally, which is why the screen may be flickering for some folks. And I guess, Jeff, since we're getting to 3:30, do you have an extra 5 to 7 minutes if we could ask you a few more questions?
Yeah, I mean, I won't be insulted if people drop off, but why don't you give me 5 more minutes of questions?
Okay, we still have about 800 people on with us today, so thanks for all the interest and probably the most questions we've ever received on any of these, even with the large we have sometimes. Next question here is from Douglas Cook, who's asking, you give daily traffic counts per street. Do peak times, rush hour counts modify your approach at all? Do you ever propose temporary lane resizing during peak times, effectively no parking during peak, or perhaps restricting turns?
So we try to use peak hour whenever we can. Almost everywhere I've worked, the peak hour is 10% of the daily. And obviously that fluctuates a little bit, but it's a quite anomalous condition to find that the ADT is not a good predictor of the peak hour. But obviously wherever we can use 1,000 cars per peak hour rather than 10,000 cars per day as our threshold, we do. I personally have never proposed, for example, lanes that go one direction in the morning or go the other way in the afternoon. I've also never proposed parking lanes that become driving lanes. I've experienced them. in Washington, D.C. on 16th Avenue, there was that condition. And I think it worked pretty well, but what I didn't like about it was that that meant the driving lane is effectively, 13, 14 feet wide when there's someone parked in it, which is wider than it needs to be. And no, I've never worked with no turns in certain hours. I'm a designer, so I'm trying to create a solution which is like permanent and physical. I'm not saying that they couldn't be a proper solution. But then, of course, you introduce in any of these, you introduce a policing aspect, you introduce a ticketing aspect that if you could solve it without that, that's probably a better choice. But I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just not part of my experience.
Great, thanks, Jeff. We'll ask you a few more questions and then we'll wrap up. Next question here is, how can the move towards electrifying our transit infrastructure coincide with encouraging walkability? I'm thinking in terms of co-benefits, like how bike lanes can also serve as snow tending zones in the winter.
Yeah, I mean, kind of different, couple questions there, but people aren't aware of the degree to which motors, I mean, you are if you go to Italy, to which the motors of vehicles impacts the livability of different spaces. Certainly in our denser cities, you have a number of places, common places, where you're actually at the level of decibels that it's not healthy to exist for any real length of time. Similarly, I was on the sustainability task force of the Department of Homeland Security under Obama. And one of the experts, I forget what city he was from, but one of the experts on the panel was from a city where they had begun to electrify their maintenance equipment. And they found that they were saving, their maintenance trucks. They found that the amount of money they were saving from sick days not taken due to people not hanging around with vehicles that have exhaust, and this could apply to bus drivers as well. They were saving more money from sick days not taken than they were for the cost of electrification. In other words, spending all day around a vehicle that's either running or idling, as often happens with city maintenance trucks and or buses, is so much healthier than having a gas-powered vehicle. So I think there's tremendous health impacts around electrifying. I think in terms of the lanes that were mentioned, now we're moving to a question about micro-mobility. I've started, depending on the audience, I've started to refer to bike lanes, which you are right, are great snow storage locations in really heavy snow areas where people, at times of the season when people aren't going to be biking anyway, that I've started to refer to those lanes as micro-mobility lanes, understanding that we need a place not just for bikes, but for e-bikes and for scooters and for electric skateboards and all the other things that you're seeing. Interesting question I didn't know how to answer that was raised recently was bicycles feeling intimidated by e-bikes that were going much faster than them and scaring them and their children in the bike lanes. I think clearly there's a kind of a speed limit at which an e-bike becomes a motorcycle, and we need to figure that out, that the absence of petroleum doesn't necessarily make it a micro mobility device when it shouldn't be intimidating cyclists in a bike lane. But the rise of e-bikes, which, by the way, if you go to New York City, you see many more e-bikes than bikes. And in Beijing, you just experience this continuum from, tricycle to motorcycle that's absolutely fluid, of all the different types of equipment that's available. I think it's a tremendous, I think e-bikes are potentially a tremendous revolution in the way that people use cities. For a lot of people, it's the way to get over the hump out of a vehicle. I was initially against e-bikes because I've always cited the health impacts of cycling and how amazing it is to get people cycling because it improves their health much more than it risks their health from injury. And I was like, well, e-bikes are just for lazy people. When in fact, I saw this truly liberating study that described how people who ride e-bikes get just as much exercise as people who ride regular bikes. They just go further and faster. So in fact, the e-bikes are potentially a health revolution as well as a mobility revolution.
interesting point. Okay, I guess last question here before we wrap up, and I'll ask you to give final thoughts. Walkable City Rules proposes the elimination of pedestrian push buttons. How would that work with ADA compliance? Push buttons have an audio feature for deaf pedestrians.
Can I be completely honest and say I hadn't thought that through? So I could BS you right now and talk about how technology will solve that problem, and I suspect technology will solve that problem, but it could be that I got that wrong. So, you know, the general, you know, mandate that we planners tend to share is that you shouldn't have to ask for the light. So when I say to eliminate, and I think if you read the page in Walkable City Rules, you'll see it's a little more subtle than that. But when, you know, the rallying cry is get rid of the push buttons, but the real request is that we don't have to wait as pedestrians. We don't have to ask to get permission to cross. So mostly when I rail against push buttons, it's against the whole regime in which push buttons play a part, in which the car dominates, in which you don't get the crossing signal until you push the button, or if you push the button, you know, it might slightly lengthen the cycle, but you don't get it for a long time, and you're likely to jaywalk anyway. I happen to live 200 feet from the only push button signal I've experienced in recent years, that when you push it, the light changes immediately. And it's because it's at a train stop across the street in my trolley that is here in Brookline, Massachusetts, that goes into Boston. I would love to see those push buttons at every intersection and push the button and the cars stop right away. So I'm not religiously opposed to push buttons. What I'm opposed to is a system in which the pedestrian isn't automatically invited to cross in a timely way.
Great, thanks. I wasn't anticipating teeing up that for you, Jeff, but I appreciate you answering the question. So with that, we could easily go on another half an hour, but in lieu of that, I guess I'll ask you if you have any closing thoughts for us today that we could take from this, in addition to us all wanting to take on these walkability studies on our own in our communities.
I didn't prepare any closing thoughts. The last question makes me remind myself to say what I try to say in most of my lectures, which is, you'll notice I don't dwell on ADA, I don't dwell on accessibility issues, because ADA is there, but also because it's one of these things like crosswalks that you kind of assume the city should take care of, and you know, they don't pay you to come in and say you need to enforce your laws. In fact, I found it is useful to show up and give a lecture and say you need to enforce your laws. But you know, what goes without saying, but I think it's useful for me to say, is that anything you do that improves universal access, right, and for people of all different abilities in your city, is going to make it better for walking and better for biking. And certainly once you get a baby in a stroller, you learn that. You learn how valuable ADA is for people who aren't in wheelchairs. So while I don't stress it, I do want to remind folks that the more accessible you make your city, the more walkable you make it, and generally the more bikeable you make it as well. So I would make that point. And otherwise, I would say I'm just thrilled that so many people chose to tune in. I do hope that I've been able to communicate to you today that there's a bunch of stuff you need to know in order to do a proper walkability study, but it's not that hard. I really did write Walkable City Rules so that everyone could do this kind of work, and not just walkability studies, but just make their downtowns more livable in every possible way. It's been the mission of my career to disseminate and share and broaden the audience for these topics. There's a lot of really good planners out there who are doing work that's just as good or better than what I'm doing, but I've found this particular niche in sharing it, and I hope that you all will share it to the degree that you can as well. But this is not rocket science, and every city could benefit from this sort of work.
Great, thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to work with you today, and thanks for coming back. You were here last year with us with Jarrett Walker. So those who may not have been here then can watch that one also in our webinar archives. So thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you all for tuning in.
Great. With that will conclude our webinar today. What is a walkability study and why should you do one? I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Jeff Speck for a great presentation, to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including one tomorrow with the American Planning Association, Equity and Policy and Practice, addressing past inequities and planning for the future, based on APA's Equity Policy Guide and its application in Charlotte, North Carolina. And with that, I will wish you all a great day.